He thought it would be harmless fun to humiliate a waitress in front of his friends, but in less than 60 seconds, he would realize he had just silenced an entire room and exposed his own ignorance. The restaurant shimmered under warm golden lights, crystal glasses catching reflections like tiny stars scattered across polished marble floors, the low hum of conversation blending with soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers, a place where people came to be seen, to belong, to feel important, and yet somehow, Sophia Bennett moved through it all like she didn't exist, her black apron tied neatly at her waist, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple knot, her movements precise, quiet, almost invisible, the kind of presence people overlooked without even realizing they had done it. And perhaps that was exactly how she preferred it, because invisibility had a way of protecting secrets the world was not ready to understand. At 32, Sophia carried herself with a calm that felt out of place among the restless energy of the dining room, her eyes steady, her posture composed, as she refilled water glasses and cleared plates with effortless grace, never interrupting, never drawing attention, just another waitress in a place full of louder voices and brighter personalities. And yet there was something about her, something subtle, that lingered, like a melody you couldn't quite remember but couldn't forget either. Across the room, seated at a long table draped in white linen, Lucas Harrington leaned back in his chair, his tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, his laughter cutting sharply through the ambient noise as his guests hung on every word, a man accustomed to admiration, to control, to being the center of attention wherever he went, his reputation as a powerful music producer preceding him like a shadow that demanded respect. And tonight was no different, except for the faint boredom flickering behind his confident smile, the kind that often led men like him to create their own entertainment at someone else's expense. When Sophia approached the table to take another round of drink orders, Lucas's eyes lingered on her just a second too long, assessing, dismissing, categorizing her in the way people often did without thinking, reducing her to a role, a uniform, a title, and nothing more. And then, with a smirk that barely concealed his intent, he leaned forward, tapping his glass lightly against the table to draw attention. "Hey," he said casually, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You look like you've got a story. Can you sing?" A ripple of amusement passed through his guests, subtle at first, then growing as they exchanged glances, the kind of shared anticipation that builds when people sense something uncomfortable is about to unfold. And Sophia paused, just for a fraction of a second, her hand still resting on the tray, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharpened, almost imperceptibly, as if something deep within her had been stirred awake. "It's just for fun," Lucas added, waving his hand dismissively, as though offering her an opportunity rather than placing her on display. "Come on, give us a song." A few phones lifted from the table, screens glowing softly in the dim light, ready to capture whatever came next, and somewhere in the background, the jazz track faded into silence, leaving a strange stillness hanging in the air, like the room itself was waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Sophia didn't respond immediately, and for a heartbeat, the tension stretched thin, delicate, almost fragile, before she slowly set the tray down on the edge of the table, her movements deliberate now, no longer invisible, no longer blending into the background. And when she finally looked up, meeting Lucas's gaze directly, there was something different there, something steady, something unshaken, something that didn't belong to a woman being mocked, but to someone who understood exactly what was about to happen next, and the room, without knowing why, began to quiet itself, conversation fading, laughter dissolving into whispers, as if an unseen signal had passed through the crowd. And in that subtle shift, in that growing silence, the first crack appeared in the illusion Lucas Harrington had so confidently created, though he didn't notice it yet, not until it was far too late. The silence did not break all at once. It settled slowly, like a curtain lowering across the room, and Sophia could feel every pair of eyes shifting toward her as if she had stepped out of the role they had already assigned her and into something they did not yet understand. While Lucas leaned back in his chair with a faint grin, confident, amused, completely unaware that the balance of the moment had already begun to tilt, and for him, this was still entertainment, still a harmless game. "Well," he said, raising an eyebrow as if prompting a delayed punchline, and a few of his guests chuckled under their breath, expecting hesitation, embarrassment, maybe even refusal, because that was how these moments usually went, the quiet person shrinking further, the crowd moving on, dignity left behind like an afterthought. But Sophia did not shrink. She did not laugh nervously or look away. Instead, she reached for the edge of the table and gently slid one of the empty glasses aside to make space. Her movements calm, controlled, almost ritualistic, and somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a server instinctively lowered the volume of the music until it faded completely, leaving nothing but the faint clink of silverware and the distant hum of the city outside. And in that fragile stillness, something shifted inside her, something older than this room, older than this job, something that had been quiet for a long time but had never truly disappeared. She stepped away from the table, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a measured pace that drew attention without asking for it, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor as she moved toward the small corner where a piano sat unused, more decorative than functional, a relic meant to suggest elegance rather than create it. And for a brief moment, Lucas's smile faltered, just slightly, as if he had expected a joke and was now watching something else unfold, something he could not quite categorize. Is she actually going to do this? One of his guests whispered, the words hanging in the air like a question no one was prepared to answer, and Sophia placed her hand lightly on the piano's surface, her fingers resting there as though reacquainting themselves with something familiar, something remembered not through thought but through instinct, and her eyes lowered, not in submission, but in focus, as if the world around her had begun to fade, replaced by something internal, something precise, something unshakable. For a second, nothing happened, and that second stretched just long enough for doubt to flicker across a few faces, for someone at another table to shift in their seat, for Lucas to tilt his head with growing curiosity. But then Sophia inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that anchors a person, that steadies everything. And when she exhaled, she was no longer the woman who had been clearing plates moments ago. She was something else entirely, though no one in the room yet had the language to describe it. And even Lucas, who had spent years surrounded by talent, by voices and performances and carefully crafted illusions of greatness, felt a subtle tightening in his chest, a quiet instinct warning him that he might have misjudged something, someone, in a way that could not be easily undone. A few phones remained raised, but the casual amusement had drained from the faces behind them, replaced by a cautious attention, and the room, without instruction, without agreement, leaned into the moment, drawn by a tension that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with anticipation. And Sophia finally lifted her gaze, not toward Lucas, not toward any single person, but toward the space itself, as if acknowledging the entire room as her audience, her expression composed, her posture straight, her presence undeniable in a way it had not been before. And then she took one small step forward, just enough to claim the space that had been offered to her as a joke, and transform it into something else entirely, something real, something controlled, something hers. And in that exact moment, before a single note had been sung, before any sound had broken the silence, the room understood, without words, without explanation, that whatever was about to happen next would not belong to laughter anymore. The first note did not arrive with force, it arrived with precision, a single tone that slipped into the air so cleanly that for a brief second, it felt as if the room itself had taken a breath and held it, and then it expanded, rich and controlled, carrying a depth that no one had expected, no one had prepared for. And in that instant, every assumption that had been made about Sophia Bennett began to fracture without a sound, because this was not the uncertain voice of someone pushed into the spotlight as a joke. This was something trained, something lived, something that carried years of discipline hidden beneath a quiet life no one had bothered to question. Her voice moved effortlessly, rising and falling with a confidence that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, each note placed exactly where it belonged, each phrase unfolding with a clarity that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if every person present had been drawn into a single shared moment they could not escape, and the phones that had once been raised for amusement now remained frozen in place, their screens capturing something entirely different from what had been intended, something real, something undeniable. Lucas Harrington's smile disappeared before he even realized it had faded, his posture shifting forward slightly, elbows resting on the table as his eyes locked onto Sophia with a focus that had nothing to do with mockery anymore, because he recognized something in that voice, something rare, something that did not appear by accident, and the realization crept in slowly, unwelcome and undeniable, that this was not a coincidence, not a lucky performance, but the echo of a talent that had been shaped long before this night, long before this room, long before he had decided to turn her into entertainment. Around him, his guests sat motionless, the earlier laughter now replaced by a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if no one dared to interrupt what was unfolding, and even the staff had paused in their work, trays held midair, conversations abandoned, every movement suspended in deference to the voice that now filled the space with effortless authority. Sophia did not rush. She did not overreach. She allowed each note to land fully before moving to the next, her control absolute, her presence unwavering. And there was a quiet power in that restraint, a confidence that did not need to prove itself because it already knew its worth. And as she continued, something else became clear, something deeper than technique or skill. There was emotion woven into every phrase, not exaggerated, not performed for effect, but real, grounded, the kind that could only come from experience, from loss, from time spent away from stages that once might have defined her. And in that subtle undercurrent, the room felt it, even if they could not name it, even if they did not understand where it came from. Lucas's fingers tightened slightly around his glass, his mind moving quickly now, searching through years of memory, fragments of voices, recordings, performances, trying to place what he was hearing, because it was familiar in a way that unsettled him, like hearing a melody you had once known but could not quite recall. And then, as Sophia transitioned seamlessly into the next phrase, adding a delicate variation that elevated the entire piece, it struck him, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, undeniable recognition, and his breath caught just slightly as the thought formed fully in his mind. The voice, the control, the signature phrasing that no training alone could replicate. This was not just talent, this was identity, and the room, still silent, still suspended in that fragile, powerful moment, bore witness to the exact second when a man who had built his career on recognizing greatness realized that he had just tried to humiliate it. By the time Sophia reached the final phrase, the room was no longer simply quiet. It was transformed, suspended in a kind of reverence that no one had planned for and no one dared to interrupt. And when her voice gently resolved into the last note, letting it linger just long enough before it faded into the stillness, there was no immediate applause, no sudden reaction, only a deep, collective silence that felt heavier than sound itself, as if every person present needed a moment to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they thought they understood moments before. And Sophia lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in completion, as though she had returned something to the world that had once been hers, and now simply let it rest where it belonged. Lucas Harrington did not move, his eyes fixed on her, his expression no longer guarded by confidence or amusement, but open, unsettled, and unmistakably aware, because the realization that had begun forming during her performance had now fully taken shape, and it brought with it a quiet discomfort that he could not easily dismiss. He had heard that voice before, not in person, but through recordings, through industry whispers, through conversations that circled around a name that had once carried weight and then disappeared without explanation. A voice that critics had called rare, distinctive, unforgettable, and now it stood just a few feet away from him, wearing a simple uniform, carrying none of the markers he had come to associate with success, and that contrast alone unsettled him more than anything else. Around the table, his guests began to shift, some exchanging glances, others lowering their phones slowly as if unsure whether they had the right to capture what had just happened, and one of them let out a quiet breath, the kind that escapes when something exceeds expectations so completely that language fails. But still, no one spoke, because the moment demanded something more than casual reaction. It demanded recognition. And recognition, when it arrives unexpectedly, often leaves people momentarily speechless. Sophia stepped back from the piano, her movements returning to the same calm precision she had shown before. But something had changed, something that could not be undone, because now she was seen, truly seen, and the invisibility that had once protected her no longer existed in this space. And yet she did not linger in the spotlight. She did not wait for validation or acknowledgement. She simply turned slightly, as if prepared to return to her work, to step back into the role everyone had assigned her, but the room did not allow it, not anymore. Wait, Lucas said, the word leaving his mouth before he could refine it, before he could shape it into something more controlled, and his voice carried a different tone now, stripped of its earlier ease, edged with something closer to urgency. And Sophia paused, her hand resting lightly against the side of the piano as she turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression steady, unreadable, and in that brief exchange of eye contact, the dynamic between them shifted completely. No longer a man entertaining himself at someone else's expense, but a man trying to understand how he had so fundamentally misjudged the person standing in front of him. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" he asked, the question direct, but lacking the arrogance it might have carried before, and a subtle murmur moved through the room, as if everyone present leaned into the answer before it was even given. But Sophia did not respond immediately. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer, and in that silence, something far more powerful than words took shape, because she understood the question beneath the question, the recognition he was struggling to articulate, the possibility he was beginning to consider, and she let it settle, let it grow, let it become undeniable before offering anything in return. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, composed, and entirely her own. "Some places do not look like stages," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not confirm or deny what he suspected. It did not reveal or conceal her past. It simply reframed the moment in a way that made his earlier assumptions feel smaller, narrower, incomplete. And Lucas exhaled slowly, his mind racing not with certainty, but with the realization that he had been standing in front of something extraordinary and had chosen to treat it as ordinary. And in that realization, there was no defense, no justification, only the quiet recognition of a mistake that could not be undone, only acknowledged. The room remained still, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had arrived unannounced and settled firmly in place. And Sophia, without another word, turned back toward her work, not hurried, not diminished, but unchanged in the way that mattered most, because she had not needed the room to recognize her worth. She had only needed to remind it what it sounded like. And in that moment, as the silence slowly gave way to breath, to movement, to the return of sound, one truth lingered unmistakably in the air: respect, once lost to assumption, does not return through apology, it returns through undeniable truth. The room did not return to normal right away. It shifted slowly, cautiously, as if everyone present understood that something irreversible had just taken place. And even as conversations began to stir again in low, uncertain tones, there was a restraint in the air that had not existed before, a quiet awareness that the boundaries between appearance and truth had been exposed in a way that could not be ignored. And Lucas Harrington remained seated, his gaze following Sophia as she moved away from the piano and back into the rhythm of her work, her posture unchanged, her pace steady, as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. And that contrast unsettled him more than the performance itself, because greatness, when it demands recognition, can be negotiated, managed, even controlled, but greatness that exists without needing acknowledgement, that continues quietly, unaffected by perception, that was something far more difficult to grasp. He watched as she picked up a tray, her movements once again blending into the background of the restaurant. But now the illusion of invisibility had been broken, and every step she took carried a weight that had not been there before, not because she had changed, but because everyone else had. And one of Lucas's guests leaned closer, lowering his voice as if speaking too loudly might disrupt something fragile. "You knew about her?" he asked, the question carrying both curiosity and disbelief. And Lucas shook his head slowly, his expression thoughtful, almost troubled, because the truth was more complicated than ignorance. It was recognition delayed, judgment made too quickly, assumptions formed without understanding, and now, sitting in the aftermath of that mistake, he could feel the cost of it settling in. Across the room, a couple who had been dining near the piano exchanged quiet words, their earlier detachment replaced by a kind of respectful attention, and even the staff moved differently now, their interactions with Sophia more deliberate, more careful, as if they, too, had witnessed something that demanded adjustment, and yet Sophia herself remained unchanged, not seeking acknowledgement, not pausing to absorb the reaction, simply continuing, because whatever she had revealed in those few moments had never been dependent on the room's approval. It had existed long before and would continue long after, regardless of who noticed. Lucas finally stood, the subtle scrape of his chair against the floor drawing a few glances, and he hesitated for just a moment, as if measuring something internal, before stepping away from his table, his usual confidence replaced by a quieter, more deliberate intention, and as he crossed the distance between them, he noticed details he had overlooked before, the steadiness of her hands, the calm precision in her movements, the absence of any need to prove herself, and when he reached her, he did not speak immediately, because for perhaps the first time in a long time, he understood that words, especially the wrong ones, could diminish rather than clarify. Sophia turned slightly as she sensed his presence, her expression composed, neither welcoming nor dismissive, simply present, and Lucas took a small breath before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words measured, sincere, lacking the performative tone that often accompanies such statements, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room leaned in again, not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet recognition that this, too, mattered, because acknowledgement, when it comes from understanding rather than obligation, carries a different weight. Sophia regarded him steadily, her eyes calm, her posture unchanged, and she did not rush to respond, allowing the moment to settle, allowing the meaning behind his words to stand on its own, and when she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "You did not see me," she said, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating a fact, and Lucas nodded slowly, because there was no argument to offer, no justification that could reshape the truth of what had already happened, and in that brief exchange, something shifted once more, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that mattered, because recognition had replaced assumption, and respect had replaced dismissal. Around them, the restaurant continued to return to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It carried a quiet imprint of what had been revealed, a subtle reminder woven into every glance, every pause, every moment of attention, and Sophia, without needing to claim it, had altered the space simply by being fully seen for what she was, and Lucas, standing there in the wake of that realization, understood something that no introduction, no title, no reputation could have taught him. That talent does not announce itself through appearance, and dignity does not ask for permission to exist. It simply waits for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. And that night, in a room that had once mistaken silence for insignificance, the truth had spoken clearly enough that no one would forget it. Lucas did not leave immediately after her words settled between them. He remained there for a moment longer than necessary, as if the weight of what had just been said required him to stand still and absorb it fully, and for a man accustomed to moving quickly, to deciding quickly, to judging quickly, that pause alone marked a shift he could not ignore, because it was no longer about control or perception. It was about understanding, and understanding, he realized, could not be rushed without losing its meaning. Around them, the restaurant had resumed its rhythm, but it carried a subtle difference now. Conversations quieter, glances more thoughtful, as though the space itself had been recalibrated, and Sophia continued her work without hesitation, placing a glass carefully onto a table, offering a polite nod to a guest, her presence once again seamless, but no longer overlooked. And Lucas found himself noticing details he would have dismissed before, the steadiness of her breath, the absence of tension in her movements, the quiet confidence that did not need to be announced to be felt. "You should not be here," he said finally, not as a command, not as a judgment, but as a statement shaped by recognition, and Sophia paused briefly, her hand resting lightly against the edge of a table, her gaze lifting to meet his once more, not defensive, not surprised, simply attentive, as though she had heard variations of that sentence before and understood its many meanings. "I am exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice calm, her words carrying a clarity that did not invite argument. And Lucas felt that answer settle in a place he had not expected, because it challenged not just his perception of her, but his understanding of success itself, the assumption that talent must always exist in certain spaces, under certain lights, within certain expectations. And as he stood there, he realized how narrow that assumption had been. A few of his guests were now watching openly, no longer pretending disinterest, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to respect, and one of them shifted uncomfortably, as if reconsidering his own behavior from moments ago, while another lowered his phone completely, no longer interested in capturing the moment, only in witnessing it. And the staff, too, moved with a different awareness, offering Sophia space without drawing attention to it, acknowledging her without disrupting the quiet dignity she carried so naturally. Lucas glanced briefly toward the piano, then back to her, his thoughts moving through years of experience, names, faces, voices, and the realization that some of the most extraordinary talent he had encountered had not been discovered through grand additions or polished introductions, but through moments like this, unplanned, unfiltered, undeniable. And yet those moments required something he had almost failed to offer tonight: attention without assumption, respect without condition. "If you ever decide you want to be heard beyond this room," he said, his tone measured, careful not to impose, "there are people who would listen." And for the first time since he had approached her, there was a trace of vulnerability in his voice, not weakness, but the recognition that he was no longer in control of the outcome of this conversation, that whatever came next would not be shaped by his influence alone. Sophia considered his words for a brief moment, not dismissing them, not embracing them, simply allowing them to exist as they were, and when she responded, it was with the same quiet certainty that had defined every moment since she had stepped away from the shadows. "Being heard is not the same as being understood," she said, and the distinction landed with a weight that Lucas could not ignore, because it revealed something deeper than opportunity, something rooted in choice, in experience, in a life that had already navigated the space between recognition and reality. And in that moment, he understood that whatever path she had walked to arrive here was not one that could be easily redirected by a single offer, no matter how genuine it might be. The room continued to move around them, but the exchange between them remained still, grounded, and Lucas nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in respect, the kind that does not seek to change or persuade, but simply acknowledges what is. And as Sophia turned back to her work once more, her presence steady, her pace unchanged, Lucas stepped back, not retreating, but giving space, understanding now that some things are not meant to be claimed or redirected, only recognized when they reveal themselves. And as he returned to his table, the conversations that resumed carried a different tone, less certain, more reflective, as if each person present had been reminded of something easily forgotten, that value does not always announce itself, and that sometimes the most important lesson in a room is not spoken loudly, but understood quietly, in the space left behind when assumptions fall away. The night did not end with applause or grand declarations. It settled into something quieter, something more enduring, as if the lesson that had unfolded refused to be reduced to a single moment of reaction. And as Sophia continued to move through the restaurant, carrying plates, refilling glasses, offering polite acknowledgments, the space around her held a different kind of attention, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but present, aware, and respectful in a way that could not be undone. Because once people have truly seen something, they cannot return to the comfort of not knowing. At Lucas's table, the conversation resumed, but it lacked its earlier ease, the laughter softer, the confidence tempered by reflection, and one of his guests leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he glanced towards Sophia. "I almost recorded that like it was a joke," he admitted quietly, his voice carrying a note of discomfort, and another nodded, rubbing his hand along the rim of his glass as if trying to process the shift. "We all did," he replied, and the admission hung between them, not as guilt alone, but as recognition, because the line between observation and judgment had been crossed so casually earlier, and now, in hindsight, it felt heavier than expected. Lucas listened without interrupting, his gaze occasionally drifting back to Sophia, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect that had taken root and refused to leave. And as he sat there, he realized something that unsettled him more than any mistake he had made in business or reputation. He had almost missed something extraordinary, not because it was hidden, but because he had not been willing to see it in the form it chose to take. And that realization carried a quiet weight that no apology alone could fully resolve. Across the room, a young couple who had been celebrating a birthday earlier now spoke in hushed tones, their attention shifting between each other and the corner where the piano stood, as if the memory of what had happened there lingered like a presence. And even the staff exchanged brief glances, subtle nods, a shared understanding that something meaningful had passed through their ordinary evening, leaving behind a trace that would not easily fade. Sophia, however, remained unchanged, her focus steady, her movements precise, her presence grounded in something deeper than the reactions around her. And as she approached another table, offering a quiet smile as she set down a fresh glass of water, there was no performance in her demeanor, no hint of someone seeking validation, only the calm assurance of someone who already knew who she was, regardless of who noticed. Time moved forward, as it always does, and the restaurant began its gradual transition toward closing, the lights dimming slightly, the number of guests thinning, the ambient noise softening into a gentle hum. And Lucas finally stood once more, this time with a different intention, not to confront or question, but simply to leave. And as he prepared to step away, he paused near the piano, his hand resting lightly against its polished surface, his reflection faintly visible in the dark wood. And, for a moment, he allowed himself to sit with the realization that some of the most defining moments do not arrive with warning. They emerge quietly, challenging assumptions in ways that cannot be undone. When he turned, he saw Sophia near the entrance, speaking softly with another staff member, her expression relaxed, her posture unchanged, and as their eyes met briefly across the distance, there was no need for further words, no expectation of continuation, only a silent acknowledgement that what had needed to be understood had already been revealed. And Lucas inclined his head slightly, a gesture simple in form but significant in meaning, before stepping toward the door and into the cool night air beyond. Inside, the restaurant carried on, the final guests finishing their meals, the staff completing their tasks, the rhythm of the space returning to its usual pace. But something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would remain long after the lights were turned off and the doors were closed. Because on this night, in a place where people had come expecting familiarity, something unfamiliar had appeared, something that could not be categorized or dismissed. And in that quiet disruption, a truth had taken hold, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that lingered in every corner of the room, reminding anyone who had witnessed it that the measure of a person is never defined by where they stand, but by what they carry within, waiting for the moment when it can no longer remain unseen. The restaurant eventually closed its doors, the last of the lights dimming to a soft glow as chairs were quietly set onto tables, and the faint scent of polished wood and lingering meals filled the empty space. But the silence that settled in that night was not the same as any other night. It carried something with it, something that had reshaped more than just a single evening. And Sophia Bennett remained for a few moments longer than usual, standing near the piano that had, for a brief time, transformed from decoration into something meaningful again, her fingers resting lightly against its surface as if acknowledging it, not with nostalgia, but with quiet understanding. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, distant voices echoing through the streets, unaware of what had unfolded inside those walls. And perhaps that was how most moments like this existed, unnoticed by the world at large, but deeply felt by those present. And Sophia did not seek to change that, because she had never needed the world to witness her to know who she was. As she gathered her belongings, tying her coat loosely around her shoulders, one of her coworkers approached hesitantly, a young man who had watched the entire scene unfold with wide eyes and quiet disbelief. "That was incredible," he said, his voice uncertain, as though unsure if the word was enough. and Sophia offered a small, polite smile, not dismissing the compliment, but not holding on to it either. It was just a song, she replied gently, and the simplicity of her answer carried a depth that the young man could not fully grasp, because to him, it had been extraordinary, but to her, it had been something else entirely, something familiar, something she had lived with long before this place, long before this life. Across the city, Lucas Harrington sat in the back seat of his car, the faint glow of streetlights passing across his face as the silence inside the vehicle stretched uninterrupted, his phone resting untouched beside him, messages appearing and fading without acknowledgement, because his thoughts remained fixed on the evening, replaying each moment not with regret alone, but with a clarity that had been sharpened by realization. And as the city blurred past outside the window, he understood something that years in his industry had not fully taught him, that talent did not disappear simply because it stepped away from the spotlight, and that sometimes the greatest voices chose silence not out of absence, but out of choice. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as the weight of that understanding settled deeper, and for perhaps the first time in a long time, he did not think about contracts or opportunities or discovery. He thought about perspective, about the quiet ways in which people reveal themselves when they are not trying to be seen, and the responsibility that comes with truly noticing, and somewhere in that reflection, the urgency to act, to pursue, to reclaim what he had almost overlooked, began to soften into something more measured, more respectful, because he now understood that not everything extraordinary is meant to be taken. Some things are meant to be recognized and left exactly where they are. Back at the restaurant, Sophia stepped out into the cool night air, the door closing softly behind her as the world opened up again, vast and indifferent and full of its own quiet rhythms. And she paused for just a moment on the sidewalk, looking out across the streetlights stretching into the distance, her expression calm, her presence grounded, as if the evening had not altered her path, only illuminated it briefly for others to see. And then she began to walk, her steps steady, her pace unhurried, blending once more into the flow of the city, not hidden, not diminished, simply moving forward on her own terms. Inside the now empty restaurant, the piano remained in the corner, still and silent, yet somehow changed, as if it carried the memory of what had passed through it, and the space around it held a quiet echo of something that could not be replicated, because moments like that do not repeat themselves on command. They arrive unannounced and leave just as quietly, leaving behind only the understanding that something real had been there, even if only for a short time. And in that understanding, something settled into the foundation of that place, into the memory of those who had witnessed it, a reminder that what is overlooked is not always insignificant, and that sometimes the most powerful truths reveal themselves not through effort or display, but in the simple, undeniable clarity of being exactly what they are, without needing anything more. The days that followed did not announce themselves as significant. There were no headlines, no sudden shifts in the world outside that small restaurant, and yet something had quietly changed in the way people who had been there carried themselves, in the way they paused before making assumptions, in the way they listened a little longer before speaking, as if that single evening had left behind a subtle imprint that refused to fade. And for Lucas Harrington, the memory did not dull with time. It sharpened, returning in unexpected moments between meetings, during long drives, in the quiet seconds before sleep, not as regret alone, but as a reminder of how easily perception can fail when it is guided by convenience rather than attention. He found himself revisiting the scene not for what he had missed, but for what he had learned. The realization that the most defining encounters are often the ones that challenge the way you see rather than confirm it. And in that understanding, something within him shifted, not dramatically, not in a way others would immediately notice, but in a way that influenced the questions he asked, the patience he allowed, the space he gave to voices that did not fit the expectations he had once relied upon. Back at the restaurant, life continued as it always had, the doors opening each evening, the tables filling, the soft music returning to its place in the background, and Sophia Bennett remained a part of that rhythm, moving through her work with the same quiet precision, the same steady presence, unchanged in the ways that mattered, because whatever the world had seen that night was not new to her, it was simply revealed. And revelation does not alter truth, it only makes it visible to others. Occasionally, a guest would recognize her, their expression shifting with a mixture of curiosity and respect, their tone more careful, their words more considered. But Sophia never leaned into that attention, never allowed it to define her. Interactions, she remained grounded, consistent, offering the same level of care to every table, every person, regardless of whether they knew what she carried within her or not. And in that consistency, there was a quiet strength that did not seek acknowledgement, only authenticity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to take their place, a familiar figure paused outside the restaurant, his reflection faintly visible in the glass before he stepped inside, not with the presence of someone seeking control, but with the awareness of someone entering a space that had once taught him something he could not unlearn. And Lucas moved through the room with a different kind of attention now, his gaze not scanning for status or importance, but for presence, for substance, for the subtle indicators he had once overlooked. And when he saw Sophia again, there was no surprise, only recognition, calm and complete. She noticed him as well, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and as their eyes met across the room, there was no need for introduction, no need for explanation. Only a quiet acknowledgement that the moment they had shared had already said everything that needed to be said, and Lucas did not approach immediately. He allowed the space to remain as it was, understanding now that respect is not always expressed through proximity or conversation. Sometimes it is expressed through patience, through restraint, through the decision to let something exist without trying to shape it. The evening unfolded without spectacle, without repetition of what had once occurred. And that was precisely what gave it meaning, because what had happened before had not been a performance to be recreated, it had been a truth revealed at the exact moment it needed to be seen. And truths like that do not repeat themselves for convenience. They remain where they belong, steady and unchanged, waiting only for those who are willing to recognize them. As the night came to a close and the final guests prepared to leave, Lucas stepped toward the door once more, pausing briefly as he glanced back into the room. Not searching, not expecting, simply acknowledging. And Sophia continued her work, her presence as steady as ever, her path her own, untouched by expectation. And in that quiet distance between them, there was a mutual understanding that required no words, no continuation, only respect that had been earned not through status or recognition, but through truth revealed without effort. And as the door closed behind him and the city stretched out once more beyond the glass, one lesson remained, clear and unshaken, that the world does not always recognize value when it first appears, but that does not diminish its existence, because true worth is not defined by who sees it, but by what it is. And on that night, in a place where it had once been overlooked, something real had been seen, and once seen, it could never again be dismissed.